Hi, friends. Today we continue our series talking about heroes from the Bible, and today's hero is Elisha, not to be confused with his predecessor Elijah, the great prophet from the Old Testament, but Elisha, in many ways, equal in his prophetic prowess, and one of the great figures of the entire Bible whose influence really even ripples beyond the pages of Scripture, all the way even into the life of Jesus himself. Elisha, one of the great prophets, not the prophet like a writer, like the prophets Isaiah and Ezekiel and Jeremiah, but a prophet whose forthtelling and truth-telling to power and his miracle working had a great deal of influence in his time in the 9th century BC. Here's a great story of a hero, Elisha. So, Elisha, the prophet, from a little tiny mound of a village, really, and outside, oddly enough, outside of Israel's proper itself. It's actually, his little village, Shaphat, was on the east side of the Jordan. And you might remember the Jordan formed the east border of the land of Israel. So he's really kind of an outsider, oddly enough, though he does his ministry in the northern kingdom. You might remember that Israel separated between north and south, kind of like the U.S. during the Civil War. So he serves the northern kingdom primarily. When I say serves, he's really kind of ants in the pants of the powerful. He's the kings and the prophets didn't get along all that well, more like John the Baptist in the New Testament in that same tradition. But he was a truth teller to power. But the kings of the northern kingdom, his ministry is about 50 years. Probably this guy Elisha might have lived almost 100 years, but his active prophetic ministry was about 50 years, and it spanned about 5 northern Israelite kings. The waning days of King Ahab, who is that king under Elijah, his predecessor, all the way through 5 generations later, Joash, toward the end of his life. So, this is the great prophet Elisha. Now, what do we know about this guy? Well, we know that when Elijah was in his cave of despair, he was told by God that he will have a successor, because when the work of God goes on, even when the man or woman of God is gone. And so God told Elijah, you're going to anoint as your successor Elisha. He'll take him in as a disciple, as a mentor, and Elijah would pour himself in many ways and at least model in front of Elisha. What does a prophet look like and what do we do? And you'll see a lot of parallels between the activity of Elisha with his predecessor Elijah. But at any rate, when Elisha is found, here's what we know about him. He seems to be a fairly wealthy guy. God actually calls this man out of a position of wealth. The reason we say that is because when Elijah found Elisha, following God's command, Elisha was driving 12 teams of oxen. This is not a poor peasant farmer. So this is a rancher. So he's got 12 teams of oxen. And when he leaves all of that, when Elijah comes to him and throws his mantle, kind of like putting his jacket over his shoulder, which is a symbol of receiving the mantle of prophetic power after him, when Elisha accepts that, he first goes home and throws a feast, sacrifices actually all 24 oxen and burns the wood that the yoke was made out of. But he throws a feast for his family, to whom he has to say goodbye, and to all of his friends, and it's a lavish feast. So the point is, this guy comes out of some real wealth and leaves that up to go into the prophetic ministry. So he follows now along, following Elijah during the final days of Elijah's life. And often the prophets, when they were wise, realizing that God's work would be larger than the arc of just their little lives, they poured themselves into someone else. In fact, Elisha himself had a disciple named Gehazi that he was doing the same for even in his own life. So Elijah begins to realize that his time is beginning to be up. He takes Elisha close to him, and Elisha can sort of realize this thing's about to come to an end. Elijah even tries to say, hey, stay behind, but Elisha realizes his master's clock is winding down. And so they go to Bethel, then they go to Jericho, and they go to these places where the bands of the prophets are, these prophetic schools. And finally, Elisha says, I'm not going to leave you. To your very last breath, I'm not going to leave you. And so they end up getting to the place on the far side of the Jordan River. Elijah takes his mantle, and like Moses did with his rod on the Red Sea, and like Joshua did with the Jordan River parts, and the two of them walk across, which is a sign of great power of God with them. And they separate themselves from the other prophetic schools, And the two of them are there on this other side of the Jordan. And that's when we have this great story where the chariots of fire and the horses of fire come and separate the two of them finally. Only God can get between Elisha and Elijah. And then Elijah is taken up in a whirlwind. You know, you've got that great song, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, right? And we think that's based on the story of the chariots coming to get Elijah. But the truth is, it wasn't the chariots that got Elijah. It was a whirlwind that took up Elijah. The chariots were just what separated them. And then Elisha exclaims, my father, the chariots and the horsemen of Israel. Remember that phrase, by the way, because at the end of Elisha's life, 50 more years later, when 5 kings later, young King Joash is attending to Elisha's deathbed, he doesn't go up in a whirlwind this time, but the phrase that Joash says out of great respect for this great prophet, he says, my father, the chariots of God and its horsemen. The very same phrase that Elisha had used way before. So it's maybe a sign not of seeing chariots, maybe it's just a sign of the presence of God, the awesome, my God, it's God. It's almost that kind of phrase. So Elijah's gone now, but beforehand, Elisha says, would you just let me inherit a double portion of your spirit? I wonder what he meant by that. Do you think it was his way of saying, you know, I want to be even a bigger prophet than you? I don't think so. This is one of the great stories of succession and mentorship in its very, very best, like Paul and Timothy or Moses and Joshua. It's one of those great stories. No, I think what he's saying is, I want to be like a firstborn. Remember, the firstborn inherited a double portion of inheritance when it was land or property or something. I want to be like your firstborn. I want to receive, I want to carry on the legacy, Elijah, of your prophetic work. I think that's what he's asking. But oddly enough, when he asks for a double portion, there are actually twice as many miracles that Elisha performs than even his great mentor, Elijah. So I don't know, maybe he got a double portion after all. Well, he ends up then with a mantle that was first placed on his shoulders that Elijah drops as he goes up in the whirlwind. Now he's got the mantle, the prophetic mantle, the sign, the scepter almost from his mentor. And the first thing he does is he strikes the Jordan River again in front of all those collected bands of prophets that were watching that. And sure enough, the Jordan River parts again, which is yet another sign that, okay, in fact, as I said, the Spirit of God that was on Elijah now rests on Elisha. It was kind of a confirmation that God was in fact absolutely in this. Very much the same way that we have after Moses parts the Red Sea, it's Joshua who parts the Jordan River. So we have that same kind of succession motif with the Jordan River again. And then all these miracles begin to happen as he just demonstrates this incredible power of God on his life. I mean, one of the very first things he does is the sons of the prophets, this prophetic school on the other side of the Jordan where he is, say, wow, you know, this pot is no good and it's poisoned. And this is one of several times in Elisha's life where he adds some salt or adds some wheat or something and he takes the poison away, and people are aware this guy really has power. One of his miracles is that someone brought a little bit of bread and he said, feed this to 100 people. And the people said, how can this little bit of bread feed this many people? And he said, trust me. And he divided it, and it was enough for everybody until they were all filled and there was some left over. Does that remind you of a story? Yeah. When Jesus multiplied those few loaves and fed the 4,000 or 5,000 in the wilderness in the ministry of Jesus, he was echoing this very miracle from Elisha. He multiplies bread and he heals anything that's poisoned. He feeds people. He makes sure that they're reminded that it's God who provides. And he's the one who's the reminder of the great power of God that's always present and with them. But he has miracles also that he does actually related to political events. So these besieging armies are coming around the kingdoms and they're all nervous about this, and they go to Elisha saying, oh no, what do we do? And again, part of his job as a prophet is not foretell the future, but tell the present. Really, that's what prophets do. They speak into where's God at work. And so what he says to the kings in one anxious moment like this is, hey, don't worry. By this time tomorrow, the enemy is going to be gone. They're going to be fleeing, and it doesn't look like that at the present. But sure enough, overnight, God does some kind of miracle in the night, and the total enemies completely leave behind all of their spoils. And so what looked like scarcity ends up becoming abundance because the word of the Lord is confirmed again and again in Elisha's life. Kind of like his mentor Elijah, there was a widow who came to him once. and had real famine, and he dealt with the famine and multiplied this oil so it never ran out. There was another widow, or not a widow, but a woman who wanted so much to have a son, and he promised her that she'd have a son even in her old age, and she did, but then the son died. And like Elijah, when he raised the widow's son, in this case, Elisha raised this widow's son from life. Again, does that remind you of the stories of Jesus where he resurrected people? It's exactly what you have in these two great prophets, Elijah and Elisha. In fact, this power was so strong that even when Elisha died, he wasn't taken up into heaven like his mentor, but when he died, a year after he was gone. There was a time when some Israelites were out in the field and a raiding party came in and they didn't have time to finish burying somebody who kind of messed up a funeral, and they threw the corpse onto the grave of Elisha, and just simply having the corpse land on top of the body where Elisha had been buried was enough for that guy to spring back from the dead. So, which is a story just to say, my goodness, the power of God is so great, and this guy had even resided in his bones when it was all over. It's just, the stories are almost bigger than life. It just reminds you what they're trying to tell us about this man, and much as they would say about Jesus centuries later, is that his mighty works were part of what drew people, amazed people, but also reminded people this is a whole nother kind of figure. And you know, God can be involved in all the ordinary moments as well. God can heal. God can do work that's through the normal and commonplace that we would understand what we might think of human agency. God can work through that, probably most often does. But sometimes God works outside the bounds, speeds up things at a supernatural rate, works outside of the bounds of our knowledge of science and medicine. And that's what you saw often happening in the story of Elisha, where God would simply accelerate, as in the case of multiplying, or heal, whether it was water, or make an axe head float, defy the laws of gravity, just all these wonderful little stories. And when you look in when you look in 2 Kings, chapters 1 through 13, it just reads like one miracle story after another, as if it was a collection of miracle stories about Elisha. Read it through, it's just one page after another of the most amazing accounts. So, Elisha, this great prophet, sometimes dreaded by the kings because he doesn't tell them what they want to hear. Sometimes he says to them, you're not going to get well from this disease, or you're not going to win this next battle. Sometimes he's the one saying, go forward in faith, you are going to win this battle. But the point is, he's more than just a miracle worker. He's not a circus, hawker. He's not just someone who draws a crowd just because the thirst for miracles, the tricky thing about that is you always want a bigger one the next time. I mean, every P.T. Barnum has figured this out. If one day you've got live animals, the next day you got to have trapeze artists, then you got to, so what he realized and what was important for God to say through him is to remind people that in the extraordinary moments and in the mundane moments, it is still God in control. It is still God in charge. Kings and powerful people think they're in charge. Not so. The small people, the poor, the widows, the forgotten, often feel like that they're out of the margin and not remembered by God. Not true. The story of the great prophets, Elisha certainly is one of them, says that God is very mindful from high to low, every station in life. And you can trust yourself to this God who is there for us, who created us, who's present with us, but occasionally, thanks be to God, sends someone to remind us about it, and that was Elisha. Well, I said his story really ripples out far beyond. In the stories of Judaism and Christianity, Elisha is certainly revered even as a saint. There's a saint's day for Elisha in the Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox tradition in June 20th or 24th. But actually, even Islam celebrates Elisha in the Quran. Even the writings of Baha'i refer to and celebrate Elisha. This guy really had a lot of influence. He may have been just the successor to Elijah, who may well have been the greatest Old Testament prophet. I mean, this guy cast a big shadow as well. And here's the deal. When Jesus Christ came, he opens up the scripture for the very first sermon on his very first debut moment in Luke chapter 4. And he quotes a text or a story about Elijah when he fed a widow in Zarephath, that is an alien country outside of Israel. Many widows were hungry, but God sent Elijah to a widow in Zarephath. And then he quotes a story from Elisha that when he healed a captain from the enemy country, by the way, the country that was at the time attacking Israel. So if you're going to hate somebody, it'd be them, this Aramean. And this guy named Naaman had leprosy, very hard disease to be healed. And he had leprosy, and so he heard that there was a man of God, Elisha, And so he came with all this gold and, all the garments and silver to try to buy his freedom from this leprosy. Elisha has nothing to do, no interest at all in any of his money. And amazingly, he's able to look past the fact that this guy is the captain of the enemy invading army. And he just tells him, he doesn't even come out to meet the guy in person, which offends Naaman terribly, that Elisha doesn't even come outside of his tent. He just says, go wash yourself in the Jordan River, which to this outsider, the Jordan River looked like a muddy hole compared to the really nice water he had back in Damascus. But he was implored to go do it. And sure enough, as soon as he dipped in the Jordan River, he was healed of his leprosy. He then begs Elisha, would you take the money that I brought? Please, please, please. And Elisha says, no, I didn't do it about the money. I did it because the God who I worship is actually a God over all the world, even the world that doesn't know him, even the world that doesn't recognize him. It's the God of the entire world who loves the entire world. And so Naaman is healed. By the way, a little subnote, the servant who would have been the next Elisha, Elijah pours himself into Elisha. Elisha poured himself into Gehazi. That was Elisha's associate. And so Gehazi went running after Naaman the Syrian as he was going away because he couldn't believe his master didn't take the money from this pagan. So Gehazi goes up to Naaman before he gets even out of town and says, you know what, my master's changed his mind. He wouldn't mind a little money after all. And so, Naaman is still so thrilled to be cured of his leprosy. He says, sure. He gives him double what Gehazi even asked for. But Gehazi was never going to give it to Elisha. He went and hid it in his own tent. And ultimately, of course, God sees everything, and so does the man of God. And so Elisha calls his servant Gehazi and says, man, what were you thinking? I said we weren't going to take that. That's not what we're about. The miracles and presence of God are not for sale. You can't thank you thank with obedience in your life. You don't thank with money even at the end of the day. And now the leprosy of Naaman is going to cling to you. And Gehazi then sort of drifts into invisible history. That's tragic, really, because he was supposed to be the next Elisha. You know what the name Gehazi means in Hebrew? The name Gehazi means greed. A tragic kind of comedy irony, isn't it? Greed ultimately makes his life come to a pretty inglorious end. But for Elisha, his story informs not only the first sermon of Jesus, but many of the practices of Jesus are an echo back, the raising of widows' children, the multiplying of loaves and fishes. And so it was Elisha, like his predecessor Elijah, who was one of those great prophetic voices that Jesus comes fulfilling not only the giving of the law, but also the prophets, when he is God's very presence and word, again reminds us in the most powerful way yet that God is powerful, but God is present, and God cares from the least to the last to the lost, every one of us. And isn't that good news for us all? Thank God for a hero. He wasn't perfect. Elisha once lost his cool because some kids were making fun of his bald head. You know how it is. And he got angry. So he had feet of clay like all the heroes do except for Jesus. But he's still someone that God could really, really use. And God can use us too, right? Even if imperfect, God can use us too. We've got a good story to tell. Like Elisha, let's go do it.
Images for Heroes with Feet of Clay are provided by Kingstone Comics.
The best-selling book of all time. Now, the most complete graphic adaptation of all time. Action, adventure, romance, doctrine, history, the future. The Kingstone Bible. Own it today.
The Kingstone Bible and Kingstone Comics, available at the First Church Book Center or online at kingstone.co.